Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. Can you hear me okay in back? Because I'd like to walk around instead of using a microphone, if that's okay. Just raise your hands if you have trouble hearing me, and I'll crank it up an amplitude or two. I'd very much like to thank Widener University and President Harris for bringing me here to the Oskin Institute, and Professor Schwartz, who we've collaborated over the last few years, to be able to have a chance to meet with you and speak with you and meet with many groups on campus here to see where we can find some connections. And of course, Ms. Bidman, thank you very much for supporting this great program. It's a real honor to be here. As Arthur said, I'm going to speak today about earning the right to lead, which can sound quaint, but it's reality. We can be appointed to a management position, but we have to earn the right to be a leader, to pull people toward us, to pull them toward our ideas, our visions, so they come willingly to support and engage in those endeavors that we seek to achieve. It's not about pushing people to do things through rewards, through punishments, through other structural matters to get people to comply with what we want to have done. And I've had a great opportunity in my career to see a lot of great leaders in action, and it's sometimes some leaders that may be a little bit wanting. And just a quick snapshot of my experience. I joined the Army back in 1987, the beginning, and spent a few years over doing border operations up and down the East German border back when we used to have West and East Germany, and then fought with 3rd Armored Division in Operation Desert Storm in 1990, participated in the Los Angeles riots in 1992, went to Panama and Cuba during 1994 during the big Cuban boat lift where we had 30,000 Cuban migrants, served in the Pentagon on 9/11. And then I had the opportunity of a lifetime to put my practical leadership aside and go study leadership in an academic environment. And what I chose at that time to focus on was what I had been observing for many years in action is leaders of character, exemplary leaders, and to see how important and essential character is to leadership. And again, you know, there are also negative role models that we observe in our life, and we can learn just as much from them as we can from those exemplary role models. So the study of leadership for me was a great opportunity, and immersed myself in it. And as it shows, came to West Point in 2005, and I'm now the Wilson Chair of Business Ethics in the School of Business at Wake Forest University when I retired from the Army in 2012. I'd like to start today's talk by putting out to you my recommended definition of leadership. There's one per leadership scholar, so you can read through the books and see thousands of them. But this is one I like to use. And it's actually a derivative of the one that's used in the United States Army. And there's a couple of key points to this definition. The first is that leadership is a system. It's not something that an individual possesses. It's not something that I can own as an individual. It's something that emerges as I interact with others. And what emerges, hopefully, is purpose, motivation, and direction of people to work toward common goals, to achieve objectives, while improving the organization. Because we can achieve short-term goals and at the same exact time destroy the organization, destroy its values, destroy its culture, destroy its morale and cohesion. And so the way we lead has to have not just short-term ideals and focuses, but even more importantly, always ask ourselves, what are those second and third order effects that we want to make sure that our leadership achieves? And one thing I'll talk today about is half of leadership is your behaviors. The other half is the symbolic effect of your leadership. What message am I sending when I act this way? What is it communicating symbolically to the organization? Am I communicating that I trust you, I respect you, or not? Am I honoring our values symbolically or not? And great leaders have the wisdom to be able to understand and decipher this and know the impacts of their behaviors in the broader realm. So when leadership is occurring, again, this is what's emerging, this sense of purpose, motivation, and direction. And the key about this definition is that anybody can be a leader, because leadership is a process. You can be an informal leader. that's leading up, influencing your bosses or those that you work for, by providing them inspiration, new ideas, creativity, inspiring them when they're down, helping the organization to work through its problems. Those are all acts of leadership, what we would call informal leadership. Or we can use the term shared leadership, where the best person at the best time is the one that gets to lead. The person that has the knowledge, skills, abilities, and the type of character that's needed in that particular situation, we have a culture and a system that allows them to lead. And then in another situation, somebody else actually has the better attributes, and we allow them to merge to lead. That is what shared leadership is, and effective leaders know how to encourage that and inspire it and bring it out of their organization. All great organizations have that upward influence. And of course, we have to have followership, followers engaged in the process, willing to be led, supporting their leaders' leadership, and then the culture and the context. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this is going to frame a lot of the other things that I will talk to you about today. Because then we have to ask ourselves, what are the attributes of the individual immersed in this system that can create this effect? So leadership is not a cause, leadership is an effect. Does that make sense? All right, that's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve leadership. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the attributes of the individual? Now, this is sort of organizational behavior 101, but just to get everybody in the correct mindset as we move forward here for the rest of the words I'm going to say today, a leader has 5 forms of power that they can use to influence others. They've got these ones down below that we, in organizational behavior, call their position powers. These are the ones that are given to you on a silver platter. The day you walk into a leadership position, they say, hey, welcome, you're the new manager, here's all your position power. Go forth and you can reward people, you can punish or coerce people, or you can tell people, hey, just do it because I told you so, and I'm in charge. And the organization has given me that legitimacy, so follow what I have to say. The problem with that is, we know from the research that leads to either people just merely complying with what you want or often resisting. And they will rarely resist your face, but they'll resist you. They'll resist your ideas. They'll find ways to not fully support it. They'll find ways to spin your message and your communication so as it comes down through organizational levels, the real message isn't coming down. They'll find ways to subterfuge some of your ideas. So the research shows that this stuff down here is maybe going to get you about 70% performance out of people. And I would even call this management, not leadership. Leadership is pulling people, again, towards you and towards your ideas. So that's where these other 2 forms of power come in, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. How do we earn the power to be truly called a leader because we are a person of character and a person of competence? And these are not stable traits. There are a lot of situations that I could be put in that I do not have the competence for that situation, and I may not even have the character for that situation. Because character isn't just these platitudes of duty, honor, loyalty, things like that. We also have to know how to apply them in practice. And when I was talking to ROTC this morning, I used the example of a doctor. You put me in the operating room, I'm of course not going to have the competence to get very far, but I'm also not going to be able to exude my character because I don't know medical ethics. I don't know the rules, the policies, the norms of that profession. I don't know the language of character applied in that situation. And so these are not traits that an individual possesses, although we can, of course, have a general sense of duty, a general sense of honor, but we have to also understand the context that we operate in. But these, moving around here, these 2 things up top are what we're going to focus on today. This is how you earn leadership because these are not given to you, and they have to be earned every single day. And this quote by Ike, and this is a picture of him on D-Day in England, seeing off the 82nd Airborne Troopers before they jumped into Normandy. It says, leadership is the art of getting somebody else to do something you want done because you've made them want to do it. And it's the best quote I've ever seen of what leadership really is at the end of the day. It's getting other people to want to do what you hope the organization can accomplish and the organizational goals. And so again, that's what we'll we'll focus on today. There's a stream of research by Ed Hollander called idiosyncrasy credits, which I find really fascinating because it's the metaphor that a leader has a bank account. And as you try to influence people, we have to spend credits because we're asking people to do things often that they might prefer not to do. They would really like to have an extra month on that assignment. They would really like to not to meet maybe that exact performance goal. They would like to maybe go home and spend more time with their family, whatever it may be. As we're trying to influence as a leader, we're spending credits, and we have to earn them at the same time and at a rate that equals or exceeds those that we're spending. And there's a lot of great research that shows what happens when leaders run out of chits in their bank account. And this is how we earn those credits. This is the trust literature. Trust literature has been very robust over the last couple of decades through all kinds of settings, business, military, profit, nonprofit, and it all centers back down on these three major factors of trust. And every one of them is necessary but not sufficient. You have to have all three. You've got to have character integrity, of course. People have to trust you and your character, that you're going to do the right thing, that your values, your ideals, your beliefs are sound in their opinion. You have to have benevolence. Does this person really care about me? Are they going to use their expertise, which is the next one, their competence, in a way that benefits me? Or are they trying to manipulate me? Are they trying to get me to perform so they can steal my ideas and steal the credit? Does this person really have an actual care and sense of benevolence toward me as an individual? There's a great quote by Wayne Calloway, former CEO of Pepsi, who's a big benefactor down at Wake Forest, that people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And it's a really true statement, and it bears out in the literature. But one of the things that is amazing, we always in scholarship talk about putting new wine in old bottles, or was it new wine in old bottles or whatever it is. But this comes from Aristotle. If you read rhetoric, he talks about ethos, pathos, and logos. It's the same basic principles. He wrote about this in antiquity, about how we persuade other people, and it's based on those same three factors. And so it really has stood the test of time. But this is how we earn our credits as a leader, by demonstrating these and continuously earning our credits, because you can't just do it once, because you do have to spend some, and they will go away. So I'm going to narrow down now. A lot of that was just to kind of funnel us into what I really want to focus on today, which is character. And character is one of those things that is highly misunderstood. There's a bunch of chairs up here. Please feel free, not going to bother me, come on up and take a seat. But when we think about character, what is the first thing we normally think about? If I say, this gentleman has character, what do you think I'm saying? Integrity, right? That, they're ethical. Maybe not, I shouldn't have used you. Him. He's ethical, right? And he has integrity, and, I can trust him because he is moral and ethical, right? But if you go back and you look at the Aristotelian views of character, it was much more than that. He spoke about the overall enduring qualities of the individual. And those were, of course, their ethical and moral fiber and their values, beliefs, and ideals. But it also included things like, the positive psychology strengths, the term we would use today. Things like resiliency and optimism and, work ethic and perseverance and other admirable traits and qualities that we want in an individual. He would also say it includes wisdom. And wisdom is also part of how do I even apply my morality? How do I apply my ethics? How do I apply my competence in a certain situation by understanding this broader aspect, second, third order effects, and all the factors involved in a complex matter, having that wisdom. And so there's different people, will organize character strengths in different ways, but that's the way that I do this for my own use. There's these moral strengths that we have. There's these psychological strengths like resiliency and many others, work ethic, and then there's these wisdom strengths, these ability to metacognitively think with future orientation and wisdom. But at the end of the day, this is a quote from Aristotle. I translated it for your behalf. It says, believe me, because I'm the sort of person whose word that you can believe, because I am a person of character with all three of these, not just, again, the moral, ethical, but all of them are, again, necessary but not sufficient. So when I became a scholar kind of late in life, I really got passionate about understanding and trying to study what do we really mean when we talk about character, and how do we apply it to this unique context of leadership, particularly context where leadership really matters, where the stakes are really high. And I don't just mean the military. There's a lot of organizations, whether it be a hospital emergency room, whether it be people that are operating in high-risk safety environments in manufacturing, whether it's offshore fishermen that are out in the middle of the Atlantic Sea. I just got back from Norway working with folks that work up on the North Sea out there on the oil rig platforms. You talk about a high-risk environment in the middle of winter. So there's a lot of organizations that this thinking applies to, but it also applies to every day in every organization. The thing that really galvanized a lot of my thinking on this was when I was in the Pentagon. As I showed you before, I've been in combat and terrorist operations and civil disturbance operations and all that. But the Pentagon on 9/11 was really a galvanizing point for me, because my office was right off to the right there, and I got called to come in the next morning and take over for this gentleman, David Lachek, who was killed along with 34 of his employees in an organization called Resource Services Washington. This organization was the one that was right at ground zero at the bottom there, had the highest casualty levels of any unit in the Pentagon. So I got called in to take over this organization the next morning after the attack. And this organization was a very important organization that controlled $32 billion of the United States Army budget. All of the big budget categories, like the postage bill for the entire Army, the transportation bill for the entire United States Army, $32 billion. This happened on September 11th. Federal budget closes out at the end of September. So we had 19 days to reconstruct $32 billion without a scrap of paper. Everything was evaporated from the jet fuel. There was nothing left. All the computers were fried. All the backup computers were fried. Everything was gone. And so I showed up the next morning to take over this organization and try to stand it back up, because we were not going to let the terrorists disrupt the operation of the United States government and not close out the budget on time, because that means the president couldn't close out the budget with Congress. How many employees do you think were there the next morning? How many? Pretty close. It was 11. Every single one of them because everybody there was no injured, because if you were at the office, you unfortunately were perished. Only people that survived were at doctor's appointments on the other side of the Pentagon in a snack bar or something. If they were in the office, everybody was gone. So there was no injuries. So the 11 that were healthy all showed back up the next morning. And these were government employees. These were not soldiers. These were accountants, financial analysts. These were budget people. They were Department of the Army civilians. They did not have to come in. They could have taken a sick day. They could have taken leave. They had all kinds of things that they could have fallen back on to not show up that next morning. So why were they there? It's a question for you. What would make somebody come back to work the next day after something like this? Resilience? Some of those psychological strengths? Absolutely. What else? Cohesion, right? To honor all their fallen comrades, particularly, right? Still accomplish the mission. What else?
They knew it needed to be done.
Expand on that a little bit.
They knew they had to come in because there wasn't a whole lot of survivors, and they knew the quality of the work they needed to be done because it was so great. So every person counted.
Absolutely. Because they had such dedication to accomplish the mission. And that dedication became even stronger when they knew there was only a few of us left to get this job done. Right? So that dedication, that loyalty to the mission was super strong. What else? Please. Courage, absolutely. Strength of courage, there's a lot of different forms of courage, right? There was no longer a physical risk, but there's an emotional and a social courage, right? To stand back after that and stand back up on your feet again. What else? Please. I'm sorry? Guilt. Ah, interesting. Guilt that they were a survivor. There's a lot of that. Survivor guilt is actually a very well developed literature that, yeah, they felt probably obligated to come back because of that guilt. But there's a lot of other terms I'm not hearing here, like duty and honor. You know, we did hear about duty to the group, cohesion, but we also have duty to the mission, duty to the country, duty to the United States Army, and honoring all of those factors. And you know, when we talked to them all, when the media interviewed them all, that's what they talked about. They talked about duty, they talked about loyalty, they talked about honor. So that's what really got me excited thinking about a lot of this, this stuff, and to decide how can I actually study it. Okay, we're locked up here. We got a tech person in the house? Because certainly not me. Ah, okay. I did something. I hit escape. I mean, luckily I didn't shut the whole thing down. So one of the things that I found in my studies, and particularly with qualitative, rich interviews with people, to try to find out where does this sense of duty and honor come from, and what I really found out, it comes from respect. Because if people really respect something, then they choose freely to honor it. They choose freely to have a sense of duty toward it, to fulfill that respect and show that respect in their behaviors. Just like in our families, if we respect our families, we will honor our families, and we will not do things to dishonor our families. And we will have duties toward our family members that we won't have to others outside necessarily because of the unique respect that we have for those. And I began to interview with people and find out that they feel the same way about their organization. They can feel the same way about the mission, that they respect the mission, they respect the value of what the organization does. They respect their leaders. This David Lachek here was actually a great leader. He's a friend of mine. Great guy. So the point becomes, when we start thinking about development, how can we gain the respect? How can we get people to respect something so strongly that they're going to freely choose to serve it through duty and through honoring it? And that's really the crux for leadership. One of the things, we went into the psychology literature, and there's this unique band of research about deonants and reactants. Reactance is that natural feeling we have to, hey, I'm an autonomous individual, don't tell me what to do, I want to have free choice, I want to have free will, you know, free love, whatever. You know, it's that total autonomy on one side. And we all have that to a certain extent. On the other side is this thing called deonants, which is this draw toward fulfilling some duties and obligations and responsibilities. They call it the ought force. It's that psychological phenomenon where we feel I ought to do something. I ought to act in this situation. I ought to do this versus that. So you have the ought force on one side, the reactance force on the other, and these two things are in constant tension with one another. And so the only way that you can have somebody really embrace duty is when the deonants force overpowers the reactance force and says, yeah, I would like to go home early. Yeah, I would like to do something else besides this. But there's enough pull over here on the deonant side that it's going to overcome that. And psychologically, factors will kick in that make people then want to act, want to stand up, take the risk, show the courage, the investments, whatever it may be, to be able to act. Now this, you don't see a lot of research on duty and honor. A lot of people think, oh, these are quaint old concepts. You know, they're not relevant today. Bull. Come on, every social institution would come crashing down if people didn't have an adequate, and we can argue what adequate is, but sense of duty and honor and loyalty. And it depends on the situation. It depends on the organization. Some organizations require more duty than others, or perhaps different kinds of duties than others. But every social institution that we know today would come crashing down if we didn't have this. If teachers didn't show up to teach their classes, decide they want to sleep in. If students didn't want to do their homework, it all comes back down to a set of duties, obligations. And so if you look at the modern psychology literature, it has all these terms about self-actualization, self-authorship, post-conventional reasoning, which means that my reasoning has gotten so advanced that you all don't matter anymore. I'm beyond you. And now I'm this individual that can make these moral, ethical judgments, self-authored, self-autonomy, because I know better than you all. And it's a literature that I think we need to get back to, is to begin to discuss what are these aspects on the other side of this coin: the duty, the honor, the responsibility, these things that really matter when it comes to social institutions and serving one another and providing value to one another and providing value to society. It's a big thing in business right now. I come from a business school, and we're really studying what does it mean for a business to be a profession. To actually, at the end of the day, provide value to society, not to be in existence just simply for return on investment, but to provide value, and the return on investment will flow with it normally. So one of the things that I began to study, and we developed a new theory about and a new measure about, is what we call duty orientation. For those of you who want to really read it, it's an organizational behavior and human decision processes. But we created a new measure through some empirical work, both qualitative and quantitative, to begin to explore what is this thing. And we found that there's three major components to it. And they're all things that I think we saw out of that example at 9/11 that drew all those members to come to work the next morning. They had a duty of loyalty to each other. They had a duty to the mission, the goals, the objectives, the vision of the organization. And they had a duty to the codes and the norms. That this is just what you do. If I'm an employee in the United States Army, we've been attacked, I come to work the next day. These are the norms. These are the values. These are the expectations of me in my group, my profession, whatever group that might be. Another thing I began to study is this issue of moral potency. And Dr. Schwartz and I spent some time this morning, along with his team, talking about the judgment-action gap. What percentage of moral ethical judgments would you estimate people on average actually live out and take action on? Take a guess. I'm sorry? Over 50? You're an optimist, which is a good psychological strength, as you saw. Others? 35. You're a little bit of an optimist. It's 20. 20%. Ethical judgment explains, on average, this has been shown across numerous studies through meta-analyses, explains on average 0.20 of ethical behavior. That's amazing. And a scholar named Blasi calls this the judgment-action gap. Because we walk through life all the time. Well, they shouldn't have done that. Oh, that's wrong. But the question is, do we actually do something about it? Do we act? And that was another avenue that I took a few years ago in my research, because again, I've witnessed this myself under some pretty tough conditions where people would choose to act or not act when they should have. And there's been time in my own life where I've acted and not acted in certain circumstances. I look back on and ask now, why not? Why didn't I take ownership in that situation? What were those factors involved in this experience that led me to not act when I should have stepped up and acted? And so we began to study what we call moral potency, which is these three factors that you see behind you here today, because we were trying to describe this 0.80 that's missing. And where are those factors that are driving that 0.80? And we found that in many cases it's a lack of moral ownership. I don't feel psychologically that I'm the one that should take care of something. I mean, just, simple example, this isn't necessarily an ethical example, but you're walking down the street, you see trash on the side of the road. Do you feel that, hey, this is Widener, this is my campus, I'm going to take ownership over this. This is not how I want our campus to look to Sean Hanna when he comes and visits this campus, or anybody else that walks on here. Do you feel that sense of psychological ownership to say, I'm going to pick up that trash and throw it away? That's what we mean by ownership. And with moral ownership, we're speaking about this impetus to act because I feel it's my job to. I'm responsible for my own actions. I'm responsible for my moral domain, those things that are happening around me, and I'm responsible for, those things that I can possibly affect that are influencing the ethicality of the context around me. The next one is, of course, moral courage, which is that fortitude, that ability to stand up, overcome perhaps risk, perhaps fear, and still act in the face of adversity, to take on those risks. And then lastly, do I have the confidence to do so? Do I feel that I can make a difference? And all three of these, our research shows, have to be really combined to get maximum effect. Because I can have all the courage in the world to stand up and face an ethical issue, but really truly feel that's not really my job to. Somebody else will take care of that. It's somebody else's responsibility to do that. Or I may have a lot of courage, but I feel that, even if I do try, I'm not going to be successful because I just don't have the social skills to address with this person. Or I don't feel I have the right relationship with this person that I could do that. Or maybe I'm not even confident in my own judgment of that I'm really right and this person's not right. Do I have confidence that I can stand up and confidently argue my case and confidently present myself in a matter that's going to have logos, ethos, and pathos when I try to persuade this person through my rhetoric to change their behavior, to do whatever needs to be done. So we find in our literature that, in our research, that these three things are absolutely critical, but again, necessary, but not by themselves sufficient. But we're finding these are explaining a good chunk of variance in that judgment-action gap, but not all, of course. The duty orientation is also explaining some of that judgment-action gap, and we're beginning to look at other possible constructs and theories that may help complete the picture of why people act and don't act. These are all individual variables, but one thing that's missing is the social and contextual variables. What are those things in the environment, in the culture, in the climate, in the leadership of the organization that can raise or lower this impetus to act morally, to close that judgment-action gap? Does the organization have a context that people can report problems without any fear of retaliation or any other negative type of impact? Does the organization have ways for people to report things, for example? Is there enough camaraderie and cohesion, as was mentioned, in the organization, that we all feel a sense of ownership? It is a we, not an I, kind of environment, which really raises, of course, this sense of ownership that people feel. So there's a lot of contextual variables that have to be brought in to this whole mix. We were talking earlier over at the Oskin Institute about courage, and what's interesting about courage is you can create an organization that encourages courageous action, and then courage becomes obsolete because you've brought down the fear, you've brought down the risk in the organization of doing the right thing. And so people can act in ways that would otherwise be considered courageous, but the individual is not really feeling that they are being courageous because they don't perceive the same level of risk and fear. Does that make sense? But ultimately, that's where you would want your organization to be. You would want to have that kind of an organization where courageous behavior comes naturally. And I can tell you the organization I spend most of my life in does. And you can ask these gentlemen in the back. I mean, when we get somebody, we give them an award for valor, we almost hear the same exact words out of every single one of their mouths, which is what? What's that? Thank you. No. They will say, I was just doing my job. I was just doing what any other soldier would have done in the same circumstance. You hear that time and time and time again. Go Google Medal of Honor and read their speeches. You will hear words like that in almost every single speech. And they truly meant it. They're not just being humble. They are truly meaning that this is what we do. These are the expectations of this job that I freely chose and had duty orientation toward, and I was living out those duties and those expectations of me. And so it is true and it is possible for organizations to create that kind of context that drives these favorable, admirable, virtuous behaviors And people that are actually in the organization feel this is no big deal. I can parachute out at 2 o'clock in the morning at 800 feet. I can slide down a fast rope out of a helicopter and not even think about, it being a scary thing, because we do it all the time. That is what we do for a living. So I'm going to close with one little quick story, and then hopefully we can have some dialogue in the next few minutes and some conversation. Who in here has heard of the Newburgh conspiracy? 1, 2. It's about right. It's about what I normally get in most groups. The Newburgh conspiracy is one of the most important events that has ever happened in American history, and we don't talk about it. I don't know why. We challenge other countries for not putting their black sore marks in their textbooks that they teach the youth, but we need to actually look at ourselves sometimes and say, are we teaching about our black points, our black eyes? Well, after the Revolutionary War, and after Cornwallis surrendered up at Yorktown, it took a very, very long time for the British to actually leave America. We couldn't put them on 747s and fly them home. It took waves and waves of ships to bring them back. So they still occupied a lot of the major cities in America for quite some time, actually. And there was this onward negotiation as they were leaving the country, even though the war was over. So just to make sure, though, that they didn't attack again, George Washington brought the Continental Army to a place called Newburgh, which is about 20 minutes, 30 minutes from West Point up in New York, the United States Military Academy, because West Point was a military base at that time. It wasn't an academy. In fact, West Point, may not know, is the oldest continuously occupied military base in all of America. And it was that before it was an academy. It was founded by George Washington. He brought the army near West Point, so if the British tried to attack, he could immediately reinforce and defend West Point and or bring the army into open battle anywhere it needed to be. So they're in this encampment, and soldiers don't do very good in encampments. These are in this day and age, these were all young men. And for months they sat in this camp in Newburgh and were pretty darn restless. Then to throw fuel on the fire, Congress came down and said, hey, we really appreciate all your service, but the treasury's run dry. We can't really pay you anymore. And oh, by the way, we promise you if you fought for America, that we would give you a half pension for the rest of your life. And we really can't do that anymore. Sorry. We're going to have to break our contract with you. So needless to say, they were not very happy. And what happened was there was this fervor of a revolution coming up through the ranks. And even the officer corps had embraced this idea of doing one of two things history normally talks about. They were considering either A, just marching the army west of the Mississippi and let the British have the East Coast and start a new country, a new government on the other side, or B, march on the capital and take over the capital in a military coup, basically, and take charge. Well, it got to the point where even Horatio Gates, the number 2 for George Washington, heard about this and actually was in support of it. And the officers were having a final meeting at a church you can go visit today. It's still there, right outside of West Point. And George Washington hears about this and walks in the middle of this meeting, unannounced. Nobody expected him to be there. And here's Horatio Gates up on the stage. And he gives his speech. History says it's not the greatest speech in the world, but he gave a speech. And then he went to pull out a letter from Congress, and he couldn't read it. So he pulls out his glasses. Nobody had ever seen George Washington wear glasses. And he said something along the lines of, I've not only grown old and gray in defense of my country, but also blind. And the room broke out crying. Actually crying. And that was it. The revolution was over at that point. Now, you have to stop and think about everything that I said today to understand this moment. It was the character of George Washington standing in front of them and the power of what he represented as a leader of character that caused that. Because he brought it to a moment of humanity and got them all to think and realize, yes, we have all been fighting for almost a decade now. We have all grown old. We have all given so much for this cause. And in his speech, he talked about freedom and liberty. He talked about the principles and the values of why they fought the war in the first place, to get out from underneath a king who used the army to suppress the people, and here they are getting ready to think about even talking about doing the same thing. And he brought all that home to them. Again, those values, those beliefs, but also the identification with him personally as a leader. So I talked earlier about identification and internalization. Both were at play here. They identified with him. They also identified with what he was saying and bringing back those values, those ideals and beliefs. And we don't talk about this for some reason, but you always have to ask yourself, what would America look like today, possibly if George Washington didn't walk in at that exact moment and give that talk and take those actions. So, with that, I will close my remarks and open it up to dialogue, and I hope that we can spend a few minutes interacting on some of the concepts that I've spoken about today. Who was first? Courage, remember? One of the attributes.
At the beginning of your speech, you talked about.
Sure.
So, in the beginning of your speech, you talked about the differences of pulling people with you. So,
There you go.
in the beginning of your speech, you talked about pulling people to work with you for a common goal, as opposed to pushing people to take order. But a trend that you see in organizations in corporate America is quite the opposite. It's still more of the push.
Right.
So in your opinion, why do you think that is so much more persistent and prevalent than the opposite of what you're telling us today?
Yeah, that's a great point. The question, if you did hear the first part of it, is, we don't see a lot of this great pulling leadership in businesses today, and I would agree with you. And I think the research shows that there's some real problems. Matter of fact, American trust, if you look at the Gallup poll, in business leaders is like 28% of people trust business leaders. You find higher rates actually in the companies that are closer to about maybe 60% or so on average, but there is a crisis. And one of the problems is that we don't spend a lot of time developing leaders. Look at an MBA program, for example, Masters of Business Administration, and look at the curriculum of almost any MBA program, to include the ones at Wake, so I'm not throwing any darts here. It's finance, accounting, strategy, marketing, operations, this, that, whatever. And oh, by the way, let's throw in one OB class for 3 credits and maybe 1 or 2 credit, ethics course or whatever. And we assume that somehow we're going to transform people into leaders of character. Well, the fact of the matter is that it takes hard work. And it takes training, education, and development to make a leader. But somehow we have this idea that it can happen through osmosis, that you're just going to on the job learn to be a leader or something. There are actual skills involved with being a leader. There are mentoring skills, there are coaching skills, there are persuasion skills, there are communication skills, there are skills to create and articulate visions that can be taught and learned and then practiced by people. But even more importantly, it's not the training and education, it's the development, the change of the mindset, so that the person begins to see themselves as a leader. They begin to formulate an idea of an identity of what is my roles and responsibilities as a leader. And at West Point, for example, when we teach cadets how to mentor, we teach them a bunch of mentoring theories, so the education piece, so they understand human psychology, developmental psychology, counseling psychology. Then we teach them skills, how to actually apply those things so they have the skills. But the most important part is to change their mindset, the development piece, so that they begin to see mentorship as being something that's important for them to do, to begin to gain confidence in themselves that they can be a good mentor, and begin to change their mindset so they're going to allocate time and effort toward doing it, and not envision their role as being, I'm the guy that runs and oversees the finance, accounting, marketing strategy of this organization, to say, well, no, I do all that, but I have this human element over here that I've got to nurture, develop, build, and grow, and that sort of thing. So it's a long-winded way to answer your question, but the problem is there's not a lot of great leader development happening out there, because there's this, at least my personal experience when I go around and talk to people, there's this idea you just somehow pick it up. Well, you can't just pick up being an accountant, You got to study, and you got to learn the norms of the field and the duties and obligations of the field, et cetera. And that's why I was really excited to come here to see what you all are doing, actually investing in the Oskin Center, investing in leader development programs, the certificate programs that you're doing, and the infusion across the campus. It's critically important. in my opinion. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.